Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Inderpal Randhawa. I'm the founder and chief executive officer of the Translational Pulmonary and Immunology Research Center. Today, we are going to be speaking about the outpatient management of the coronavirus. I think we are in another week where we are seeing conflicting information. We have seen in just 1 week over 10,000 new fatal cases, and yet across the US, the distribution of positive cases and these fatal cases is actually going across more and more states. So what this essentially means is we're going to be dealing with this virus for the better part of the next 12 to 18 months likely, and we're going to be doing so without exactly clear indications of what testing will look like, what drug treatments will look like, and even what vaccines will look like. I hope that in the last few videos that we've been producing that you have a better understanding of each of those steps, and today we're going to focus first and foremost on the concept of vaccines. To date, we have over 40 potential vaccine candidates. I have sat on several vaccine councils in my 2-decade career as an immunologist. I can tell you that the production of a vaccine is extremely difficult. And indeed, if they are able to design and actually utilize an effective vaccine by this fall, that will be absolutely unheard of in human history. And so the question that should be asked is why? Why is it so difficult to produce vaccines? Well, the fact is technology has changed, and we do our best to produce vaccines against bacteria and viruses, and we have much greater success against bacteria than viruses. If you look at this diagram, you can see that there are multiple different strategies on how they're actually trying to attack this virus via vaccine. Some of it involves DNA, some of it involves RNA, and some of it involves normal inactivated attenuated viruses. And yet all of these strategies do not have a clear 100% chance of actually working. And the reason for that is that viruses are very difficult to predict when they become seasonal. Small mutations change the impact of that virus across the immune system. And remember just 3 things when it comes to vaccines. Number 1, a vaccine must be built in such a way that all of the proteins that the virus actually is trying to express is present in that vaccine across the season. Number 2, it must basically integrate and build into the immune system appropriate immunity, not just for a month or 30 days. It actually has to do for at least 6 to 9 months, much like we see with the typical flu vaccine. And number 3, the vaccine cannot cause any harm. That's really important. We don't want to have the vaccine cause the disease or cause any form of immune activation that can be potentially harmful. And I think there's a very good story to be told here. In the last 2 decades, there's been a heavy effort to come up with a vaccine against a very common virus called RSV, also known as respiratory syncytial virus, a very common virus that impacts babies, premature infants, and young children. This is a massive problem. Several companies have spent well over $1 billion trying to come up with an RSV vaccine. It had early promise, and then last year, phase 3 study, complete failure. So I think we have to be really cautious, and we have to temper our expectations on what a vaccine will look like. I do believe we will see a vaccine by this fall. I think this vaccine will be somewhat effective, and I believe that it will largely go to the elderly, the high-risk population, and folks like myself who are physicians dealing with these patients directly. So hope is there with vaccines, but the reality is it will take cycles of them to become better and better. So we look at this from a drug standpoint as well. And I think what you see here on this slide is basically a list of every single drug that is currently being tested in treatment of coronavirus. And they're largely broken down into either anti-inflammatories or antivirals. Some of them you can already see have failed clinical trials. And I think when you look at this, most people are asking, why is it so hard to come up with a drug to treat this virus in the United States? And even in Europe, they're already having approvals of some drugs, and here we are not there. It's very simple. Basically, the US has a heavy amount of federal regulation. That's not a bad thing. That's there to help people stay safe. But in times of emergency, when we need something rapidly deployed or rapidly built, it becomes a bit of a hindrance. And we are in a situation now where we are dealing with an orphan disease. Our organization here is actually highly focused on orphan diseases, which are defined as conditions that have no active form of medical therapy. And when you are put in a situation where you have to treat an orphan disease, what is it that should be done? Well, physicians who treat orphan diseases know that we must find some form of an answer for these patients. We must try to find some significant way to treat their disease with what we have available and see what kind of best outcomes we have. What happens when physicians have to actually treat orphan diseases? They innovate. And for the better part of a month and a half now, I've said that we need to find a way to treat COVID in the outpatient setting. It has been done in other countries, and I'm happy to say there's actually one large organization in the United States who has actually done this relatively recently. The Cambridge Health Alliance, which is affiliated with the Harvard system, had decided many weeks ago that they were going to try and move the treatment of COVID to the outpatient setting. How did they do that? Well, they basically created a system that had telephone triage available, so patients who thought they might have the virus were able to call in. Very specific set of questions led them to get early testing in a specific localized site. Those patients then, if they tested positive, went to specific community clinics that actually would assess the risk of that patient. And for those who were moderate or severe, they would actually send them to a respiratory clinic. That respiratory clinic would actually start forms of treatment, and the results speak for themselves. These patients, total enrollment of 1,100 coronavirus positive patients were in this system. Of that, 50% were moderate or severe, which is a significant amount. And in that group, 92% of them were able to be managed successfully in the outpatient setting. That's a remarkable number. 8% of them required an emergency room visit, of which most of them actually went home, and very few patients ended up in the hospital. So I think this is an amazing example of, again, some innovation without a drug or without any specific new treatment, but operating within a system to achieve the best result for the patients. Also of interest, this process that I just described at Cambridge Health Alliance allowed them to use almost minimal to substantially less PPE since it was an organized system. Contrast this with what we're hearing from the current government entities. The National Institutes of Health just this last week came out with their recommendations of COVID. Large organizations like the American Thoracic Society, the Centers for Disease Control, you can summarize their current active recommendations for coronavirus as this. Step 1, if you think you're positive or you test positive, you get tested. Step 2, go quarantine for 14 days. Step 3, hope that you actually get better, just rest and monitor your symptoms. Step 4, either you get better or you get worse and you end up getting hospitalized. That right there is the summary of their current steps of recommendations. If you end up getting hospitalized, what happens next? Well, you receive lots of oxygen, you'll be put in isolation. Drug therapy at that stage is highly questionable unless it's in a clinical trial, and there's a likelihood that you could get intubated and put on a ventilator, and we all know the outcomes of that are not very good. So we're in a situation again where the recommendations by the major governing organizations are based on strategies that are based on clinical studies that take more and more time. All the while, we have patients who are dying. And so systems like the one I mentioned, where outpatient management is taking hold, are showing success, similar to that's been done in other countries. How are those systems really looking at this? Well, this is something that can be applied to you and your family. So this is basically a disease that involves only two systems. There's the lungs and the blood. And it's primarily a lung disease. So in the end, this is all about oxygen balance. And we actually categorize coronavirus in three major categories, either mild, moderate, or severe, all based upon how much oxygen requirement is there. If you have a mild case, those are standard symptoms, cough, fatigue, maybe some gastrointestinal symptoms, but your oxygen levels hold themselves up. If you're a moderate case, you have those same symptoms, but you may require a little bit of oxygen, usually less than 2 liters per minute. If you're a severe case, you require much more oxygen and you may see other organ systems becoming engaged. This is the basic breakdown. And it does work. It works even in an outpatient setting. It can even work in the approach of treatment of you or your loved one at home. The first step in actually assessing patients is testing. Once you test positive, there are two assessments that are needed. Number one, assess yourself. And this needs to not only be done once, it needs to be done on a daily basis. It needs to be documented and organized. Assess your cough. Assess your shortness of breath. Assess your GI symptoms. Assess and see if these symptoms are progressing or are they stabilizing. It's a very important concept. Number two, it requires a physician assessment. What is a physician going to do in the case of coronavirus? Well, they're going to, at the very minimum, listen to your lungs. They'll do a physical exam. Number two, they're going to check your pulse oximetry, basically measure the amount of oxygen that is in your blood. That's a very key component. Number three, they will do a chest x-ray. A chest x-ray will identify more progressive pneumonia, and that's a different type of case. And number four, if available, they will even do a spirometry, or what's called a lung function test. That type of testing is also very important because it tells you how tight or restricted your lungs are, and that can have a secondary impact. So two assessments are needed in the outpatient setting. Once that's done, you can categorize the patient more effectively. So the mild cases, again, as we discussed, would be categorized as having an oxygen level greater than 93% on pulse oximetry and a negative chest x-ray. Again, greater than 93% on oxygen, and nothing found on your chest x-ray. For patients like that, you have a good opportunity to approach, again, the two systems. You want to approach your lungs and you want to approach your immune system. Well, what are the best ways to do that? Number one, go home. Actually stay in a quarantine, which is appropriate. Number two, hydrate yourself reasonably. Control your fever. The World Health Organization has walked back all the criticisms that were initially on Motrin, so whether it's Tylenol, whether it's Motrin, keeping the fever curve down is a good thing during this disease. Vitamin C, basic antioxidant, basic doses that are needed. Remember, in the intensive care units right now, they're using literally 8 times the dose of what's mentioned here, and it has a good antioxidant benefit. Another supplement is called quercetin, which is basically another form of an antioxidant that's relatively natural and has minimal downside. Zinc, another good form of an antioxidant that has a good effect across many other viral diseases. And lastly, melatonin. Melatonin helps block inflammasome cascades and has some other anti-inflammatory benefits that are relatively specific to the coronavirus family. These are all opportunities to really modify the immune system without causing any sort of harm. In addition to that, vitamin D3 has some benefits towards the immune system, and I'd say towards the lungs, albuterol, a simple basic bronchodilator. It keeps your lungs open. A dose of that every 6 to 8 hours on a scheduled basis, meaning even if you feel well, you do that on a scheduled basis for 5 to 7 days. Now you put yourself in a position where your lungs have a maximum opportunity, your immune system and blood are nice and calm. And I do think for patients who are over the age of 40, given the issue that is currently present with the amount of clotting that could potentially occur, a baby aspirin of something of that nature is a reasonable thing to do. Keep in mind that if you have any sort of stomach problems, that's something you want to pay attention to. So remember, all of these recommendations are there for largely an adult setting, and these are have been used across the globe with a large degree of success. If this is a child who has this condition, it's recommended that you can utilize the same types of medications. However, I would say we don't recommend aspirin in these cases, but the rest of those drugs can be utilized effectively, but you need to ask your pediatrician about proper dosing. So in that case, where you're in a mild form of the disease, what else should you do? Well, you need to assess. You need to check your symptoms every day. You need to check your pulse oximetry every day. And if you are able to keep your oxygen levels above 93% while you're at home and with mild activity, you will recover from this in 7 to 10 days. That's the typical course that we see. And the wisest thing to do at that stage is to go get retested and make sure you're actually negative. Now, if you're not in the mild case, the next more severe case would be moderate, where your oxygen levels are actually greater than 93%, but you have chest x-ray findings. So what that means is your chest x-ray has evidence of pneumonia, or your lung function tends to be very low. That's evidence that you are at higher risk. And in that type of situation, you want to do everything that was previously recommended for a mild case. And in addition to that, you want to look at other options. One option is an inhaled corticosteroid. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about the role of steroids in this condition, but the facts remain. The facts are patients who are on inhaled corticosteroids, which are millions upon millions of Americans, have asthma, they have COPD. Their disease, if they get coronavirus, is literally negligible. And there are arguments from the original SARS case all the way through research that's occurred over the last 2 decades that a low dose of an inhaled corticosteroid likely has a significant benefit with minimal risk for the patient. So that's something that should be discussed with your physician provider. Next, an incentive spirometer. This is a simple device that many of you have seen that allows you to take big, deep breaths in. These devices are exceedingly helpful to keep your lung volumes as high as possible while you are awake. If you keep your lung volumes engaged, that helps you clear this infection, clear the mucus that's associated with it, and you're on the way to recovery. Next, sleeping. Sleeping prone, sleeping on your stomach actually allows you to ventilate or open up the areas to exchange oxygen in the lower base of your lungs. That's something you see a lot in the media. This is something that can be done very easily at home if you're in this type of case situation. Walk and walk often. You want to, again, keep your muscles engaged, you want to keep your cardiac output engaged, and you want to keep your oxygen exchange at a maximum level possible. Other things that might be considered at this kind of situation are antibiotic courses. Now, antibiotics do not actually treat a virus, but if you look at the post-mortem analyses of the cases of coronavirus, we see a significant amount of bacterial pneumonia that develops after 5 to 7 days of the disease if they are chest x-ray positive. These drugs are safe. They are utilized as anti-inflammatories as well, and they've been widely used for many, many decades. Lastly, the physician needs to reassess these patients regularly. I'd say certainly within 48 hours, it's a mandatory thing to do to make sure that you're continuing to improve. These type of moderate cases can do exceedingly well in this type of management setting. It is still something that requires self-assessment as well as physician assessment. Then there's the next case, the severe cases, and this is again based on an outpatient management of treatment. These are patients who have oxygen levels less than 93%. Whether or not their chest x-ray is positive or negative, most of them are chest x-ray negative. These patients should be evaluated in an ambulatory care setting. That means either an ER or urgent care, a place where they can actually receive oxygen and be monitored for about 6 to 8 hours. This is actually commonly being done right now. And what happens is they study the patients over time, determine how much oxygen they need. They will deploy many of the same drugs that have just been previously mentioned for other cases, and they will determine how much oxygen the patient needs to be stabilized. Many of these patients only need 1 liter or maybe 2 liters of oxygen, even when they're exercising and walking around. Those patients can actually be sent home with that type of oxygen requirement for 1, 2, or 3 days safely. They can also require other drugs. Sometimes they will use a single dose of systemic steroids, and again, that can be done safely. They can also add other types of anti-inflammatory drugs like hydroxychloroquine or colchicine. There are many that are potentially being utilized right now. This type of an approach allows somebody to recover even with a severe case of coronavirus under acute management and over 1, 2, and 3 days of physician reassessment to have a full recovery. If this fails and this type of high-risk patient does not do well, then obviously this patient would end up in the hospital and undergo typical types of management that we are seeing currently. So these are the 3 types of cases that exist. And with active assessment, early testing, early treatment, you can actually get the vast majority of these patients under excellent care and control, and it does work. The current healthcare system as it stands does not have widespread outpatient management of coronavirus available. However, you can be your own advocate. You can create and build your own form of outpatient management. How do you do this? Well, first and foremost, you need to identify and monitor your own symptoms. Secondly, you want to identify a testing site, a place which can test and return results quickly. You don't want to do that 2 or 3 weeks from now. You want to do that now. You want to have that available in case you actually end up having symptoms. Next, you want to make sure that you have access to a physician who can do that assessment that's necessary. Make sure that they're comfortable with that, they can do it in person and monitor the proper findings that are present. Thirdly, you want to identify an outpatient site for early treatment. That's a very key concept, meaning that if there's an ambulatory care site, in case symptoms start to progress, you'd like to have that opportunity available so that you don't have to necessarily end up in a hospital setting. Lastly, you want to purchase proper medical equipment at home. That may include just a basic thermometer. It should also probably include a pulse oximeter, which you can purchase for a nominal amount of money. Having these things available and planning ahead allows you to be your own best advocate and have access to this form of step-by-step therapy, which provides the best possible outcomes. COVID can be diagnosed early, we know that. We know it can be treated early, and we know that provides the best overall outcomes across the board. So next week will be my final presentation on coronavirus. As you know, several months ago, I designed a timeline that is held accurate on this condition. I will do my best to create a 12 to 18 month calendar timeline that comprehensively explains where this virus is going, what major industries inside and outside of healthcare are doing to make sure that we as a population can get past this. In addition, I will ask you to comment below with any questions that you may have about coronavirus, and I will do my best to select 10 to 12 questions and answer them as thoroughly as I possibly can. I wish you all a healthy and happy weekend. Thank you.